I like the photograph.
I had a coat like that.
Okay, should we start?
You're
Sure.
going to start with your business first, though. I'm just sitting back. Yes. Okay. All right.
All right, Mary, you ready? Well, welcome everyone to the League of Women Voters March Lunch and Learn program. I'm Robin Schmidt, President of the League of Women Voters of the La Crosse area. And I want to thank you today for joining us to hear from Dr. Jodi Vandenberg-Daves on the history of feminism and what it means to us today. Before we start the program, I do want to take a minute to repeat the words of the League of Women Voters of the United States CEO, Virginia K. Solomon. And she says, quote, "As democracy in Europe is being threatened, we support and stand united with the people of Ukraine." Mary, are you able to show that slide? Thank you. We support and stand united with the people of Ukraine. An attack on democracy anywhere is an attack on democracy for us all. We stand in the belief that democracy will always prevail, both international and right here at home. So I'd like you to all just take a minute and think about what democracy means to us, and we'll take just a moment of silence for all of those who are fighting for their freedom in Ukraine and throughout the world. Thank you. And speaking of democracy, I want to remind you all that early voting in the La Crosse area starts on March 15th. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I remind you that the best way to exercise our democratic rights and to honor Ukraine's plight is to vote. So on to today's program. This program is being recorded and a link to it will be on our website in a few days. If you have questions for our speaker, please type them into the question box located at the bottom of your screen. We'll monitor the question box and leave time at the end of the presentation to group and paraphrase questions for our speaker to answer. The League of Women Voters, a nonpartisan political organization, encourages the informed and active participation of citizens in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. I'm going to turn the program over to Ellen France, who will give us an update on recent voting-related issues that could impact our upcoming elections. And then Mary Nugent, our amazing program committee chair, will then run the program. Ellen, let us know what's going on. Thanks.
Okay, I'm losing my screen every now and then, so I don't know why. So bear with me. Can everybody hear me? People hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So just a couple of things. One is that you probably saw that our Wisconsin Supreme Court put back in place the injunction against drop boxes for the April election. They haven't decided that case on the merits yet, but they didn't do it for February because the decision was too close. But they figured there's lots of time for people to adjust before the April election. And so the drop boxes that were available before won't be. To me, it's not encouraging that they're going to decide this case in a way that allows drop boxes in the future, but we don't know that yet. You probably also read that the voting fraud investigation by Justice Gableman came out with some results that most commentators did this on him. But they did extend the contract. He and Robin Voss extended the contract to the end of April to, one would hope, finish his investigation and have this one be gone. But it's still out there. He was ordered to provide materials that many argue are public records by a court the other day. Now, whether that he does that or it happens or somebody says, no, we don't have to do it now because the investigation's not over, because we have the new contract, that remains to be seen. The other thing that happened last week was our Wisconsin Supreme Court adopted our governor's redistricting plan, which is not what many of us would want in the end. But because our Wisconsin Supreme Court said we are going to look at plans with the least number of changes, and we're not going to consider partisan assignment of voters, then this is better, marginally better than the Republican plan. That has already been petitioned to the United States Supreme Court. The people on the other side primarily, although I understand there was also one voter, minority voter, who also joined the request for the Supreme Court to take this case up. The first thing they typically consider is deciding whether or not they are going to put in place a stay. That's normally would be part of the request from the losing folks, that they not put the new maps into place. That probably is unlikely to happen because they just earlier this week refused to put stays in place in 2 redistricting cases out of Pennsylvania and North Carolina. They also have to decide, of course, with the Wisconsin case, whether they're going to take it on the merits. So that decision, only a few cases end up being taken. Whether this is one, who knows? They haven't decided yet to take either the North Carolina or Pennsylvania cases. And I'm just gonna, if I can bore you a little bit more, the congressional maps in those cases were put in place by the highest court in those respective states. So they couldn't agree below the Pennsylvania and maybe Superior Court, I don't know what the correct name is, and the North Carolina highest state court redid and picked the maps. And the people that appeal that argue that they make the claim that the United States Constitution and its elections clause, which says that the manner of federal elections shall be prescribed by the legislature, means that the state courts can't act. Okay, nobody's followed that in 200 years, but that's the argument that's being made. So I would just put on your watch list how it may not take Wisconsin's case, but if they take one of these others, then they will determine, I guess, whether there is a majority that agrees with that proposition, even though it hasn't been applied in 200 plus years. You just never know what's going to happen. So that's all for me.
Thank you, Ellen. So our presenter today is Dr. Jodi Vandenberg-Daves. She is a professor and chair of the Department of Race, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at UWL, teaching on topics of women's history and women's leadership. She is past executive director of the Greater La Crosse Area Diversity Council and is the author of 2 history books, including Modern Motherhood in American History, a book of poems, and numerous research and popular articles on gender issues. Welcome, Jodi.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the warm introduction and the opportunity to be here. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Yes. Are we good?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen here. I'm unmuted now, right?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Thank you for the kind introduction, and it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Happy International Women's Day, one day late. I had to teach yesterday. The invitation was extended for yesterday, but I had to teach. And I just so appreciate the work of the League of Women Voters. You all are keeping an eye on what we really need to keep an eye on. You are, part of the heartbeat of democracy and protecting our rights to vote. And you do wonderful work, and you may not hear it enough, but you are very much appreciated. So, and thank you all of you for being here today. I'm hoping for good technology. I have done Zoom presentations before, it should be fine. But just because I'm in my office, I will probably run out of battery, and then you'll see a small pause, and I'll plug my computer into my monitors, and you'll see me looking away from you. But I wanted to start out looking at you. So do feel free to interrupt me with questions or comments, or especially if something is not going right with all our technology, let me know. But I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I want to talk about this. This is a broad how feminism changed our lives. It's a sort of feminist history 101. My training is in history, and I could go on and on about it, and I'm going to try to keep it so that it's, I hope somewhat digestible. Definitely time for Q&A. And if I find that I'm really just not, if I'm not able to cover what I'm covering here, I will skip ahead so that we can definitely have some time for conversation, which is often my favorite part. So how did feminism change our lives? I'm sure so many of you could talk about that in your own lives. And so, this is just such an introductory way to look at it in a way, because feminism has changed our lives, not just legally and policy, but also a million different social and cultural ways. But let's talk a little bit about the history of feminism within the United States context. I'm narrowing somewhat. We could talk about this globally, but historians often talk about the first wave of feminism from about the 1840s to about 1920, and you'll recognize the date 1920. This movement created a suffrage movement, a suffrage movement that managed to get important work done, took about 70 years, also had a lot of race and class schisms within that movement. It was by no means a united movement. It was a movement in which African-American women were asked to march at the back of the parade in 1913. And there were all kinds of issues around that. But it was a movement that managed to change the Constitution. And it included not just suffrage. Suffrage became sort of that end point for many feminists, but the beginnings of it were in the abolitionist movement. Many women were active on issues of temperance, of trying to ban alcohol, finding that men were sometimes drinking away the paycheck, and that they, saloon owners were the subject of their wrath, or the object of their wrath. Rights within marriage, including rights to divorce, rights to even be legal persons within marriage, were part of the feminist movement of this time period, because there's a doctrine of coverture that's like a common law tradition coming from Britain that says that a woman is not really a legal person if she's married. She doesn't have rights to sign contracts in her own name, keep her wages if she makes them, no rights to property. Feminists worked on that as well. They were also talking back in 1848 about access to education and the professions, and the fact that men had hogged a lot of those to themselves, and issues of pay. By the early 20th century, the feminist movement was talking, parts of it, people were talking about birth control. Margaret Sanger, Mary Ware Dennett, others. And then there was also an economic justice movement. There was a lot of overlap between socialism and feminism, between labor justice movements and feminism, racial justice movements and feminism. So there was a lot of economic and racial justice movement as well. But like I said, the kind of overarching what can we do and focus on became, in the last 20 years or so, suffrage. But suffrage for whom, was a question. So the Constitution was changed, the 19th Amendment in 1920. This is where we kind of see the crest of the wave, I guess, if you're talking about a wave of feminism, right? It was a partial victory because many women of color couldn't vote because of Jim Crow and other restrictions, and racial, racial caste system kept in place by violence, literally. About 90% of African Americans were living in the South where they couldn't vote. And so it took until 1965 with the voting rights and all the work of the civil rights movement to really achieve a broader suffrage victory. Nonetheless, this was an enormous step forward to have the 19th Amendment. And again, we can, save your questions if you want. I can talk more about the first wave of feminism, but I actually wanted to jump ahead to a little stuff that's a little bit more within our memories, or the memories of our mothers and grandmothers. And so I'm going to jump ahead to World War II and how that reshaped the possibilities in the US and created the conditions for what would become a kind of a second wave of feminist movement. Women were brought into industrial jobs. I asked my students, where do you see women in the history textbooks? And, Rosie the Riveter, there you go. One of the few times that comes up, because women were brought into factories when men were over at war. And it really reshaped women's labor force participation and therefore gave them a toehold as citizens in certain ways. Most of the women who went into the Rosie the Riveter factory jobs were already working in the poorly paid service sectors. African-American women, the primary occupations available to them were domestic service and agricultural work. This was also true of often Indigenous women, Asian American women, Latinx women, and many poor white working class women were also, cafeteria workers or, retail, and getting to work in the unionized industry of the factories was a game changer in many ways in terms of raising expectations around work. And it helped remove some legal and cultural barriers to married women's employment. The Rosie the Riveter campaign, the propaganda that the US government generated, basically said, hey, if you can run a sewing machine, you can run a riveter or something, things like that. If you can do a juice press, you can do this machine. And so the mystique of these industrial jobs that only men could do became removed somewhat. And people figured out that, some people already knew that married women could work, particularly women of color always had higher rates of labor force participation, in part because of the discrimination faced by men of color. But you see a broader swath of the US population understanding that married women could work. There's a lot of anxiety around it, but it did happen, and it started to shift over. Like there's a book I read in graduate school called From Working Daughter to Working Mother, as sort of a 20th century shift in sort of who is our standard woman worker. African-American women moved into jobs outside of agriculture and domestic service in larger numbers than ever before, still faced massive discrimination. Racial and gender discrimination was still legal. Until 1964, an employer could tell you straight up, I won't hire you because of your race or your gender. But we still see shifts, the labor market shifts, the migration of many African Americans to northern cities, the change in cities. All of this raised women's expectations. And part of what I argue when I teach the sort of overview of the history of women in the US in the modern period is that women are moving more and more into the public. And this World War II situation is certainly part of that. Labor feminism was one piece. Excuse me, I'm gonna take a lot of sips of water here. Women's union membership grew a lot during the war. Even during the 30s, it had grown because of partly the change in the way the unions had created a broader kind of participatory union movement. So that becomes another toehold, like an institutional structure for many women to get their voices heard as workers. And you get a critical mass of women in some unions, including the United Auto Workers Union. That was a big one. And they started, especially the UAW, started putting women's issues on the map. The unions were also instrumental in challenging racism within their ranks in many cases, and trying to eliminate wage differentials. Again, not across the board, the more progressive unions, they're sort of the cutting edge here. There was still plenty of racism and sexism within the union structures, but these changes were happening, and there were people at the leading edge. So some people, particularly in the UAW, women pushed for the inclusion of sort of women's issues within their labor contracts. So asking for childcare, calling for government funding and employer funding of childcare. We're still waiting on a lot of that, but they started asking for that, normalizing kind of what are workers' issues. Maternity leave, another one. And a big one for unions, the elimination of separate seniority lists for women. They used to go through all the men, and then the separate women's seniority list would come second. These were important challenges to the idea that men controlled, men were the workers, men were the breadwinners, men's issues were the issues around which unions might do collective bargaining. Within the labor unions, that's where we see the first battles for equal pay for equal work. Part of the issue, part of the reason many union men supported that was that they knew that while they were away at war, women were doing their jobs. So if they came back and employers could say, oh, we don't need you, we got women, they'll take, 50 cents less an hour. Why would we need you? They understood that they needed to champion the work. And so some of these men got behind the equal pay for equal work to protect the value of the work, not necessarily because they approved of women's earnings. Post-war feminism found one of its organizational homes in the progressive labor unions. And that's actually where Betty Friedan got her start. She didn't end up writing like a labor feminist in The Feminine Mystique, but she did get her start there. And if you ever get a chance to see the film Step by Step, Building a Feminist Movement, it's a really nice documentary of Midwestern women actually in labor. They really cover labor pretty well. Union women were in now a multiracial movement. This was different than the more segregated movement of the first wave, defending the role of the female breadwinner. Something that organized African-American women had been doing for decades, but that white women were pretty new to. Then we get the post-war period and the pushback against a lot of this. The Red Scare, in which there was a purge of a lot of progressive organizations, in which there was, like unions, racial justice organizations, feminist organizations were really put on the defensive in the McCarthy era. Feminism was something you're not supposed to talk about anymore. Hey, we won that battle. Suffrage happened. Today we continue to have a discourse around the denial of gender inequality. Well, they had it then too. And ours is now, hey, we got these laws. And theirs was, hey, we got suffrage. Like, why do we need feminism? So feminism was something old fashioned and no one was supposed to claim that identity. I once did a presentation on it as the other F word. So it's not like an entirely new thing, but it was important in this period. In this period, there was a huge emphasis on private life, and the nuclear family was supposed to be the primary source of your identity and your achievements even. It was a kind of less return to domesticity. We just had the disruptions of the Great Depression and the war, and people often found solace in returning to these traditional gender roles. In fact, I just talked with my students in my history of motherhood class, like, sound familiar? We're dealing with like massive disruptions in the last few years, and that is causing some segments of our population to want to crack down on gender, sexuality, and racial justice. So this was happening in that era too. Women's rebellions against the patriarchy were pathologized. You're a neurotic woman, or maybe you're a communist, or maybe you're both, if you are talking about some of these things. So a real backlash here. And one of the things this meant was that the feminist theory and feminist accomplishments of previous generations really kind of got lost. And remember that, they weren't teaching women's history hardly at all in this. We didn't get women's studies programs that therefore included different disciplines dealing with gender until the 1970s. There was a virulent anti-feminism. For sake of time, I'm not going to share this link, but if you wanna just really kind of have your jaw drop, watch a woman doctor who wrote a book with a male journalist talk about how women should be staying at home and out of the workforce, and they were threatening marriage and men's egos. And this woman is literally standing in her white coat talking to the camera with her female stenographer behind her, saying that women's careers are a threat to society. And she goes on to see a patient, presumably. But there's a lot of backlash. So some people refer to the 1920s through the 1950s as a sort of doldrums of feminism in general, partly because, suffrage was the big kind of coalition building movement, and that ended. So actually, people often say that the League of Women Voters is a successor organization to the two major national suffrage organizations. And the League had a minuscule percentage of what those organizations had, because people lost their energy. They lost their momentum after 1920. And then we had all these other interceding events. Again, not the stuff wasn't going on under the surface. As I mentioned, and I'll keep saying this. So the National Women's Party continued to do its work promoting the Equal Rights Act, which was first introduced to Congress in 1923. But it was an elite group, and really an elitist group, a very isolated group of women that clung to many class and race prejudices. At the same time, they continue to say, we have to have an ERA, we have to have an ERA. They introduced it every single congressional session. The American Association of University Women, Business and Professional Women, and the League of Women Voters, I'm sorry, I don't know if I have that on there, but yes, you all kept promoting women's advancement in various areas. Women of color kept the issue of citizenship alive. Women like Zitkala Sa, also known as Gertrude Simmons Bonin, helped found the National Council for American Indians and pushed for citizenship, which didn't always look, maybe when we write the history of feminism, if they were not talking about gender, were they advancing feminist causes? I say yes, they were. They were talking about citizenship. They were advancing women within these organizations. The League of United Latin American Citizens was formed in 1929. And in those spaces, women, many immigrant and women of color, carved out spaces for themselves and developed the leadership that some of them would bring to National Organization for Women and the labor movement causes as well, around gender and race and the intersection. And so a lot of women of color were keeping alive, like, what does citizenship look like? How do we continue to advance that? And I'll talk about African-American women in a minute. And again, the labor union movement. Also going on, the Daughters of Bilitis was formed in 1955 in the middle of the Leave It to Beaver era. This is the first lesbian civil rights organization. It's small, but they have a publication. People start to feel like they could be seen. Some of the issues of sexual orientation, discrimination, homophobia start to get a little foothold somewhere in the culture. Both political parties had women's divisions, although they started to get eliminated in the 50s, kind of like, who needs them anymore? But they were there, all the women, even if those organizations sometimes got eliminated, think about generations of women developing organizational and leadership skills. Wow, my battery's going already. Hang on a second. I'm gonna have probably a little pause. This will take a minute. Can't see myself yet, so just give me a minute. Can you hear me? Okay. Can I advance the slides? That's another, we'll see. Different current slide.
Yeah, go play from current slide and see what happens.
Okay, I think we're there. Yeah, great. Sorry, thanks for your patience. And now I'm looking sideways at you. The sustaining of lots of networks, even in this time of the doldrums, the development of leadership is important to remember. Racism continued to hinder coalitions. Throughout the 1950s, National Women's Party, American University of Women, Business and Professional Women all had separate chapters for African-American women. And some National Women's Party leaders made public racist statements. Then as now, race is a big dividing line, and we're talking about women's issues. Whose issues, which women, is always important to consider. And meanwhile, the Black women activists continued their work. Now my row of people is blocking my words a little bit, so I'll do what I can here. Just to take you back a little bit, the National Association of Colored Women was formed back in 1896. So this had been around for a long time. It was the first national African-American civil rights organization. I like to emphasize that because it preceded the NAACP, and it was women, and it was national. And they contributed significantly to the suffrage struggle, even while enduring racist slights from white women and being asked to march at the back of parades or have separate chapters. In the post-World War II era, the NACW continued to do its work and continued to focus on racial gender justice issues. To take a few words from their platform, to secure and use our influence for the enforcement of civil and political rights for African Americans and all citizens, to obtain for African American women the opportunity of reaching the highest level in all fields of human endeavor. Part of the context also for all of this is the fact that women are increasingly moving into the public, as I mentioned. That retreat, there was a retreat to domesticity that was very much emphasized in the 50s, but it was temporary and partial. And when I say it was emphasized, it's like the very, very low age of marriage. Women were reading books that said if they hadn't found their man by the time they were 23, they needed to really consider how they were strategizing this project. But it was always tenuous opportunity to sort of return to this like domesticity. It's true that the economic situation of the 1950s was, the United States was so flush and the GNP was growing so rapidly that there were more people, more working class and women of color who could have a male breadwinner and work, the women could work less. But again, that was tenuous. We also see just there are long-term demographic, social and economic patterns that are changing things so that like the idea of containing women in this little box of domesticity is just not going to work. So by 1960, 30% of married women were working, even if their work was often invisible, because a lot of those women were working while they would go to work after the school bus left and they'd be back after the school bus came home. But actually married women's labor force participation increased in the 1950s. And we start to see the normalization of the married woman. I'm going to just let you read those slides for a second. Or those bullet points. So the continuing trend of women working outside the home was critical to the rise of feminism. The age of marriage, which had plummeted in the 1960s and gotten down to 20.1 as an average age for women somewhere in the middle of the 50s, started to creep up again in the early 1960s. Women had more access to birth control. They were bearing a lot of babies still, but a lot of them had all their babies by the time they were 30 because they were using birth control and they had a lot of their lives left and they were looking at what was going to happen for the rest of their lives. We also see changes in sexuality. There were more social opportunities for sexual relationships that weren't sanctioned by one's family, dating in cars and things like that, and more public spaces. We see the sexual revolution as something that didn't just start in the 60s, but traces its origins really probably to the early 20th century. There was a lot of cultural discussion of the rising problem of unmarried pregnancy. There was a very unsafe environment for abortions. In fact, probably less safe in the 50s than in the 30s. This is really the era where women were blindfolded and taken to undisclosed locations and had abortions by unsavory characters often. Other changes in sexuality, more gay and lesbian bars are emerging in the World War II era. I mentioned the formation of the Daughters of Bilitis. So the 50s is like this time period of like, oh, we're trying to contain it, but it's not going to be contained. Education too. American women were rapidly achieving new educational milestones after the war. More women flooding into higher education. They were out achieving men in high school academics and more were going to college. I once spent some time with my dissertation research, which was on first generation college women, digging into some newspapers in Minnesota and finding that, wow, just about every valedictorian or salutatorian was a girl. Girls were out achieving boys. They were also on leading just about every activity in high school, except for like the sports. There's like a lot of female leadership and achievement that's being developed here in the shadow of all that domestic, propaganda. By 1986, as it turned, just to give you the long-term trend, women would be out achieving men and earning their bachelor's degrees. but there's like a concrete ceiling going on. This is, again, what cannot be contained. The entering classes of medicine, law, and business were on average 5% female between 1940 and 1970. And then we're going to get feminism that I'm about to talk about. And then you get closer to 40% by the 1980s, like take the lid off. So I'm trying to emphasize how in this middle of the century, there's just these trends that sort of can't be contained. Women want education. They want more sexual freedom. They want reproductive freedom. They're in the workforce anyway, and they want a better situation in the workforce, just to name a few of the kind of public demands that we'll see women are making. So we start to see the emergence of early second wave feminism built upon the union movements and the civil rights activist movements. We could argue built upon the suffrage victory, but again, there's so much silencing of that in some ways it's hard to say that. The early stages were reformist, not revolutionary. I like to emphasize that because I think there is definitely a broad cultural discourse about bra burning that, and the cultural revolution of some of the later 60s feminists is important. I'm going to talk about it, but it's also important to note that a lot of this came from women who were kind of the World War II generation, and they wanted basic reforms for like legal rights and policy changes more than they were interested in a cultural revolution at first. And that's part of the story too. And it's actually part of the ongoing work of feminism. So a lot of those activists sort of came of age in the 1940s. Maybe some of them actually, if you watch that step-by-step video, it reminds me how some of them like took on leadership roles on college campuses or in other ways because men were away at war. This was a generation of women with greater educational opportunities, but a concrete ceiling. And by that, I mean, not that no women could get through it, but that you had no legal protections against discrimination. And there was just such an emphasis on, you can't be a working mother, you can't even necessarily be a working wife because you might be neglecting your husband. And there's just a real animus against the woman worker. It's still there. And again, for some women who helped bring about the feminist activism, they had this background in other kinds of activism. So this is the backdrop to the President's Commission on the Status of Women. John F. Kennedy appointed this Commission on the Status of Women. In one of the films I've shown in my classes, there's a nice little clip of someone asking him, you know, you've done this for the different populations, what have you done for women? And he kind of jokingly said, well, whatever it is, I'm sure it's not enough, ha, 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 and kind of got a big laugh from the men because women's issues were very often trivialized. But he nonetheless did appoint this commission, especially orchestrated by Esther Peterson, who was the first female cabinet member of an administration under FDR. She became the Department of Labor, the Labor Secretary. And what resulted in the early 60s was this broad coalition that was brought together by the President's Commission. Government groups, education, labor, representatives of various women's organizations, and I've named some here. And I just thought it was funny, an editor from the Ladies' Home Journal, which was usually edited by men, by the way, as were most of these women's magazines. Go figure, women did a lot of the background stuff. But this is the first big like national attention to women's issues here in the early 60s. They deliberately were told, we don't want to talk about the ERA because, well, you can, I won't go into great detail. There's like divisions among women on the ERA for one thing, and I can tell you about that in the Q&A. So what the President's Commission did was research and document the discrimination against women. No one had done this. People started to look at all the state laws, what was women's status in employment, in what ways were they not fully like legally free human beings, you know, like still underneath that coverture idea that they existed under their husbands. You know, women often couldn't serve on juries, they couldn't get credit in their own name. No one had documented these realities until the President's Commission on the Status of Women gave us a larger picture. Because again, there was like no academic research on this. I mean, the closest we had was whatever the Labor Department and the Women's Bureau within that was doing. But that was, you know, not enough. And this infused a real urgency and awareness. So it mobilized a lot of resources to document a problem that was, again, often ignored and often assumed to be inevitable. You know, sort of like, well, of course, women are in these different jobs and making less money. They're mothers, they're wives. And it also mobilized people, women and men, who might never have met one another. So it became a little bit of a network building. And every state then had a commission on the status of women, and those commissions remained. And so feminism, even after the document, like here's the report on the status of women, which came out in 1963, even after that, you had an organizational base for feminism. So in 1963, they presented this report very modestly and very ladylike, and yet they called for things that we still don't have: publicly funded childcare, publicly funded education, adult education for women or anyone who's doing caregiving and going back in the labor force, income guarantees for all women. Imagine that. This also helped set the stage for the Equal Pay Act, which was one result of the commission, which said where women and men do exactly the same job, they receive the same pay. Didn't fix a lot of problems, in part because women were doing different jobs for the most part, and those were the low paid ones. But it put it on the map. It had a lot of exemptions, but it put equal pay on the map, federally. Then we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a signature achievement for the racial justice movement of the civil rights movement. One of the most important pieces of legislation in the 20th century. I talk about it in every history class and every women's studies class. This came about, the causes of racial and gender equality kind of merged, lots of social movement activity, but most of the driving force was the civil rights activists for racial justice, some of whom died for the cause. There became this debate about Title VII. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act was to prohibit employers from discriminating in employment on the basis of race. Pretty important. And as the law initially read, race, creed, like your religion, or maybe if you were a communist, race, creed, or national origin. Sex, discriminating on the basis of sex was not even in there initially as something to be prohibited. Southern congressman from Virginia added the word sex to the list, many say as a joke, to kill the legislation. He was opposed to the civil rights legislation in general. The amendment stuck, again, another long story. And it's amazing to think about that when we think about like moving something this huge through our political system, that someone threw in this word sex, which is like, okay, now we're going to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex, which many people thought was just like the natural divisions between women and men. And it passed along with the most important racial justice Civil Rights Act in the history of the United States. So 1964 was a pretty big year. What it created was the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission as well, a federal agency that actually had teeth about enforcement, or it was supposed to. Women of all races immediately flooded the EEOC with complaints about gender discrimination. And many on the EEOC were like, what? We thought that was just like an add-on. So they initially had limited power to enforce, and they were not very interested in the gender stuff. They just weren't interested in enforcing that. They were, for example, not enforcing, there were gender segregated want ads all across the country. Help wanted male engineer, help wanted female babysitter, that kind of thing. Many women, including the lawyers Polly Murray and Mary Eastwood, who were, Polly Murray, amazing woman to look into, who coined the term Jane Crow in the law, said, this is not okay. And the women's commissions across the state kind of jumped on the issue, and the result was the formation of the National Organization for Women. NOW was formed because of the EEOC's unwillingness to enforce this. So again, NOW was not like a radical organization initially. It was very much like, let's enforce the law for women. Meanwhile, in popular feminist thought, we have the feminine mystique, has to be mentioned, bestseller of Betty Friedan, who again got her start in the labor movement, but spoke of herself as a very it was a very whitewashed vision of what the issues for American women were, very middle class oriented, but she nonetheless spoke to a lot of women who felt very sidelined from, perhaps the education, using the education they had gotten. She started this whole project with her fellow Smith College graduates and what they were doing. Lots of back and forth letter writing, lots of raised consciousness. Friedan identified what she called the problem that has no name about femininity and the feminine mystique. And she named the discontent of many middle-class housewives, priming the pump for more discussion of gender. we look at race and gender in the early to mid 60s in this stage of feminism, we see some intersectional analysis. I teach a history of feminist thought, and we do see, women of color having prominent voices in some of these conversations and publications. It was a more racially diverse group than before. Again, Polly Murray and Mary Eastwood, a Black woman, well, actually a transgender person, Polly Murray, that's a story that came out later, and Mary Eastwood, who was white, collaborated on the Jane Crow and the law work. There were interracial spaces created in women's activism within unions now. Addie Wyatt, in the really powerful voice in that Step by Step film, first Black woman elected as the international vice president of a labor union, and she was instrumental in forming NOW. NOW was an interracial organization from the beginning. Eileen Hernandez, an African-American union organizer and civil rights activist, served as the first president. And Polly Murray, again, I mentioned, wrote Jane Crow and the Law, huge important piece of legal theory around gender and the law, linking racial and gender discrimination patterns. So we see the origins of that. And sometimes I want to emphasize this because I think there can be a little bit of a sort of confusion about what is feminism all white? That to say that actually dismisses the contributions of women of color in this period, which were significant. Not at all to argue that there wasn't a lot of racism to be dealt with then and now on the part of white feminists. This created an infrastructure and network for legal reform that would reshape American society. So in the second wave, unlike the first wave, remember I talked about like right to be a legal person, suffrage, a little bit about birth control. The second wave, that march to the public into the public really matters. Workplace rights were very important. Citizenship rights, pushing for the ERA. Access to the public sphere, full access to all educational opportunities, all professional opportunities. A lot of cultural critique started to emerge that being a wife and mother should not be women's only goal. How were women going to consider like working outside the home and labor force participation? Again, a little bit more theoretical and practical work across the lines of race as well as class and sometimes sexual orientation. So we get that infrastructure. Just a little, I'm going to only read one of these. I'm looking at the time. National Organization for Women. We men and women who hereby constitute ourselves as the National Organization for Women believe that the time has come for a new movement toward true equality for all women in America and toward a fully equal partnership of the sexes as part of the worldwide revolution of human rights now taking place within and beyond our borders. They wanted all the rights and privileges with men, but they also didn't want any conflict. They kind of didn't, we're like, we can be wives and mothers and we can work it all out. The late 1960s saw a real shift in what feminism looked like. This is another sort of part of the second wave that is really the cultural radicalism of the second wave. And that's coming out of women in the New Left, anti-war movement, shifts in the civil rights movements, racial justice movements. These movements were raising issues of women's oppression. They wanted to apply the democratic principles of social justice movements to the relationships between women and men in those movements and beyond. So the civil rights movement, which had begun in the 50s and was doing all this community organizing, involved a lot of young women of various races who were developing the skills and critiques of social inequality in America. Black women played these critical leadership roles. White women were often not in the field organizing, partly because it would raise hackles about interracial this interracial white women and Black men, and that could be dangerous to the Black men involved. The second class citizenship of women within the movement began to be questioned. Within all these movements really began to be questioned. Like women are doing a lot of this work, but men are the charismatic leaders, and they're not often treating women well within the movements. In fact, there was a lot of male resistance to women even talking about gender, even in these like revolutionary movements that were going on. Shulamith Firestone, a feminist who demanded a women's rights resolution at the Students for Democratic Society meeting, the chair prevented her and said, "Move along, little girl, we have more important things to talk about than women's liberation." which was a common patronizing attitude among many leaders of the male left. They used a kind of infantilizing images of women, like put them in little dresses, and sometimes also aggressive language towards women who demanded their rights. The social movements of the late 60s, there was a lot of frustration. There was, I mean, you know, think about the Vietnam War, the fact that while the Civil Rights Act had happened and voting rights, people had died for it, and there was still all these economic dimensions to racial injustice. There was police brutality. You know, people were, it was a time a little bit like today in terms of the foment of all kinds of movements, but it became somewhat less hospitable place for women. Even the anti-war movement, you know, they had slogans like "Women say yes to men who say no," which is like, wait, we're giving away our sexuality to men who resist the war. Also, some parts of the New Left became the counterculture, and that was not always kind to women. It was a lot of sexual exploitation happened in those movements, and women didn't often know how to name it. The Black Power and Chicano movements started to portray more macho imagery versus beloved community imagery. Cultural nationalism in those movements sometimes put women in second class positions. And the search for authenticity within some of the racial justice movements, sometimes translated to relegating women to more, you are the mothers of the next generation. So we start to see a women's liberation movement coming in response to all of this, and also building upon what those reformist women had already done. There's kind of a generational split here. These ones starting the women's liberation movement, those are more like your baby boomer women coming of age in the late 60s versus your greatest generation women who are often starting the other stuff. So women start organizing separately from the men. And starting developing this consciousness raising where they talked about all kinds of issues that were not just, you know, can I get ahead at work, but they were also like, what's going on in the bedroom? What's going on in conversations? What's going on in housework? What's going on with beauty images? I feel this way too. Oh, I didn't know other women felt this way. Wow, this isn't just me. What's going on with, you know, domestic violence? All these things are coming out in what feminists called the consciousness raising of the time. There were also demonstrations around, you know, a big one was the Miss America a pageant demonstration, a kind of a guerrilla theater operation, and you see an image of that on your right. The slogan became "Sisterhood is powerful." Never a slogan, you know, a slogan that always had problems then and today, that because sisterhood is not easy. But there became this like, let's focus, let's pull out gender as the key area of organizing. So we get this real social movement, broad coalitions, many divisions within it, but trying to articulate what do women's rights look like in this moment. Women of color feminisms were critical to the ideas and the impact of the second wave. The way we teach women's gender sexuality and race gender sexuality studies today, women of color are often the key theorists that we teach to students, and some of that work came out of this period. Development of lesbian feminism as well, also really critical to making a more intersectional, powerful kind of critique of American society. Working class feminist movements, demands for economic justice among labor union women and women who were, you know, working as secretaries and getting all kinds of mistreatment. Interplay of, we have parallel movements, again, the fomenting of lots of movements, right? The LGBT movement is rising at this time, racial justice movements continue. A slogan that was super important for feminism was "the personal is political." The idea of wages for housework, you know, politicizing intimate aspects of social life. So it's, again, it's not just change the law. It's like, why are we tasked with all the domestic stuff? Who does the housework? Who takes care of the kids? Alexis Shulman wrote a marriage contract that was circulated in all the women's magazines that she and her husband had put together about, like, let's make this fair. Who creates and sustains the beauty ideals? Who's sexually satisfied and why? Ann Kett circulated the myth of the vaginal orgasm, which was a very interesting critique of Freud. How does sexism impact and create heterosexuality? How does it create what Adrienne Rich called compulsory heterosexuality? How do we get all these stereotypes? How do they get perpetuated? Another piece of that connected to reproductive rights. You had abortion speakouts where women talked about their experience with botched abortions. Women rap about sex. Women had consciousness raising about sex. They did catcalling operations of men on Wall Street to say, see how this feels. They did take back the night marches. There was a women's strike for equality in, I think, 1971 with 50,000 women marching on New York. It must have been 1970, sorry, 50th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. For women who continue to focus on anti-racist work, there were also global analyses of imperialism and more intersectional discussions around gender and race in that context. Lesbian feminism continuing to develop, enhancing feminist theory. Also, you know, a lot of like, is being a lesbian the answer kind of discussion in that period. Lots of new theory about like how do race and gender together show up in like women's healthcare access or defining reproductive rights. Billy Avery, for example, founds the National Black Women's Health Project and looks at how we can't just talk about gender and women's access to healthcare. We need to talk about how Black women experience healthcare. And, you know, fast forward to the knowledge we have about Black women's higher rates of maternal mortality than white women. A lot of this is naming things. I like Audre Lorde's work about the power of naming. And as an instructor of this material for the intro level, I feel like just building students' vocabulary, building on the naming that these feminists did is important. So the Red Stockings, the radical feminist group, talked about the sexist foundation of all our institutions. Adrienne Rich named compulsory heterosexuality and helped us think about how we're socialized to that. She named compulsory motherhood and helped us think about that. We see new views of institutions in relation to gender. Why are, you know, what's the medical control of women's bodies look like? How are women portrayed in the media? How are the schools telling us how to behave? What about all our intellectual traditions? Putting men at the center. This is something I teach about at great length in the history of feminist thought. What about all the ways that the pop culture just teaches us to devalue ourselves and emphasize our beauty and domesticity? How about the child rearing experts? Dr. Spock, who was so beloved in the 50s, got a talking to by Gloria Steinem in the 70s. So we got a lot of institutions being built in this time period as well. I'm looking at time and I'll just emphasize maybe one or two that you haven't heard of. I mean, you know, creating our bodies ourselves. Combahee River Collective is an important Black women's organization. 9 to 5, watch the movie, but they demanded raises, not roses. And that movie from 1980 was based in part on Wisconsin insurance workers. Jane Fonda interviewed them and looked at the sexism built into office work. There's a growing radicalism, which contributes to a public backlash. We had the Now statement of purpose, which was nice and ladylike, as well as the president's commission statement. But then we have the radical movements. So while Now said, we're going to innovate new social institutions without conflict with roles as wives and mothers, by 1968, the feminist Ty Grace Atkinson was comparing marriage to slavery and echoing early 20th century Emma Goldman when saying that people in the future would be tied together by love, not legal contraptions. Kind of a blow it all up around many of our cultural institutions. They even had this Society for Cutting Up Men for a little while, which was a joke, but kind of a joke that some people didn't take well. Or Witch, Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell. There was a lot of like, we're all in on just blowing up this whole gender dynamic, figuratively, not literally. Meanwhile, though, the legal changes go on. The Equal Pay Act I mentioned, the Civil Rights Act I mentioned, and then in the 1970s, a whole big slew of it. Women voters start to be taken seriously. We get a lot more full citizenship rights. Thank you, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Women can now administer their own estates, and we don't like serving on juries, but if we're going to be full citizens, that's our responsibility piece, right? In 1972, the ERA passes the House and Senate. It is still not there, but it, you know, imagine a moment when it had passed the House and Senate. Oops, sorry, that's a repeat. And then it was defeated in 1982. We get the National Women's Political Caucus. So when I talk about like developing organizational infrastructure, this is still a very important one. We have the National Women's Political Caucus, which advocated for the ERA, against tax inequities, educational equality, equal pay. And at that time, imagine a moment, it was supported by both political parties. It was considered good politics. There were, for many years, pro-choice Republican women. Okay, did I skip ahead? Still no ERA, we still don't have it. 1970s accomplishments though. Title IX in higher education, we're looking at the 50-year anniversary. This was not just about sports. It was about the fact that institutions could discriminate in financial aid and in admissions to like law programs and things like that. Eventually, we're going to use Title IX around addressing campus violence and harassment, becomes a legal framework for that. Access to credit for married women, we start to chip away at the idea that women, men are the breadwinners and a married woman doesn't need any rights. Criminalizing rape within marriage, that's also a chipping away at the idea that a woman is a man's property that 19th century feminists were addressing. We get rape shield laws, shielding women testifying about rape in court from being asked certain questions, like what were you wearing and what's your past sexual history. We get reproductive rights, contraceptive access, but also Roe v. Wade, and an end to the worst abuses of sterilization that were impacting women of color. Could talk on and on about reproductive rights, but reproductive rights is not just contraception and abortion. We had institutionalized the sterilization of women of color, especially Black women in the South and Indigenous women on reservations, and that starts to shift. We see a Pregnancy Anti-Discrimination Act built into the Civil Rights Act so that women could no longer be told, you're pregnant, so you don't need to work here anymore. I see you'll be having a baby soon. In Wisconsin, an interesting idea came up that apparently got a lot of resistance, and this was not the only state, but I think Wisconsin was the first. Shared marital property, saying if a couple splits up and she stayed at home with the kids and he earned the paycheck, he shouldn't get all the money that he earned because she was doing work too that actually counted. Like the work she did with the kids, that counted for something. That was revolutionary. Many men in the Wisconsin legislature who had gone along with other reforms did not like that, but it passed anyway. Just to emphasize reproductive rights for a moment, in 1972, there was an overturning of the 100-year-old tradition of allowing states to ban access to birth control and even information about birth control. And in 1973, we got the right to abortion with limits. That right, as you know, is threatened right now. I'm gonna, again, I'm looking at the time. Sterilization abuse issues were also brought up in court by amazing people like the young lawyer Antonia Hernandez, who protested that Mexican-American women were being sterilized without their consent in California. She lost the case, but we developed, there new guidelines developed within government agencies, and we started to see these shifts, which are, again, a little more complex. Sexual harassment became a violation of civil rights in the 1980s. With Michelle Vinson, the woman pictured here as the primary plaintiff. Black women were often in the forefront of these sexual harassment, sexual violence kinds of activism in cases. So then we got sexual harassment as a form of sex discrimination in two different ways. Quid pro quo, meaning like I'll hire you if you have sex with me, or I'll give you a promotion if you date me, and hostile work environment, which I can explain if you want me to. In the 90s, we got the Family Medical Leave Act, which, you know, by world standards is pathetic, but by US standards was a step forward, which is to say, if you have a baby or other family situation come up and you've worked for the employer for X amount of time and some other specifications, you still hold your job open for 12 weeks unpaid, or that can be flexed in a variety of different ways. All other industrialized countries have paid leave. We got this as a revolution in 1993. There were people on the in Congress who said if a woman misses one day of work for having a baby, her employer has the right to fire her. But those people were overridden, and we have something. In the 1990s, we also got the Violence Against Women Act, which was co-authored by now President Biden. And it created more federal law around violence, funding around training for law enforcement. We at UWL have a violence prevention office because of the funds of the Violence Against Women Act. We got a grant for it, and then thankfully the institutionalized it to better serve our students. In the 2000s, we got the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which is a start, didn't do enough, but really primarily says you can't have like a statute of limitations on when a woman can sue. And I can talk about that too in the Q&A. And we'd love to have a Paycheck Fairness Act, but we didn't get that in the 2000s. In the 2010s, the Affordable Care Act is particularly important as a feminist advancement because it expands preventive services. It eliminates what a whole bunch of states allowed, which was a gender rating saying you could charge women more for insurance policies. And you see more, breastfeeding accommodations, midwives and birth centers, birth control available without co-pays. Women, now we have women in Congress saying, hey, how come men can get Viagra covered by their insurance companies and women can't get birth control covered? And that made a difference, not without pushback, as I'm sure a lot of you know. In the 2010s also, we got Obergefell v. Hodges, the 5-4 Supreme Court decision arguing that a fundamental right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples on the basis of the 14th Amendment, which that 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause was the basis for a lot of feminist victories. In the absence of an ERA, feminist lawyers worked with the 14th Amendment, and LGBT rights groups did as well. There are lots of ways that women are still vulnerable with respect to our government, and I'm sure you know many of them. Violence Against Women Act was barely renewed in 2013. It's up for renewal in 2022, and they're not able to do it yet. Sexualized violence is rampant. I want to just especially point out the US military. Sexual harassment is illegal, but why did we have a Me Too movement? It's still there. All our different institutions could be reformed to or revolutionized to prevent violence and assist victims of violence. Other areas, women are a rising percentage of prisoners in the country, and we have more per capita incarcerated people than any other country in the world. And a lot of those women lose custody rights to their children, and those women are disproportionately Black and brown and disproportionately suffer from mental illness that's often not addressed. Poorer communities, especially people of color, are being devastated by racist policing, gun violence, mass incarceration. There are still many legal liabilities still in place for people who are LGBT. Our weak labor laws and our weak protections for unions are impacting minimum wage workers, and 2/3 of minimum wage workers are women. Women still have a double day more than men. Lots of family needs could be addressed. Wage legislation, childcare, education, stuff that women tend to vote more on than men. Paid family leave, reproductive rights. You hear most from the people who are opposed to abortion in all situations, but looking at Gallup poll, even since the 70s, that's a small minority of people. Most people are in the middle. We're using women's reproductive rights as a political football. We could expand employment rights, enforcing employment law, including equal pay. It's hard sometimes if you have to sue to get your rights. We have seen a stalling in women's progress towards senior level positions, and still sort of these inverted triangles where if you look at who's at the top of organizations, it's disproportionately male, even though we've had 50 years of legislation to prevent that. Overt and covert discrimination still impact women in hiring, especially women of color. There was a study of, they do these like fake resume studies, make their resumes identical except for one thing to test discrimination with employers. And they did an Emily and a Lakeisha resume. So a white sounding name and a Black sounding name. And Emily got so many more callbacks with her resume. And then they kept tweaking it. What if we add more education for Lakeisha? You had to add 8 more years of education for Lakeisha to get the same amount of callbacks as Emily got, which shows you a lot about the intersection of race and gender discrimination. Representation and legal rights matter. So the US ranks 100th in the world for representation of women in national legislatures and parliaments. We're supposed to be promoting democracy, but we don't have a gender democracy. we did have a lot of changes in 2016 in terms of pushing women into political office, as you know, and the big 2018 victory. But we also see a lot of schisms among women. And, the whole sisterhood is powerful. How does that work when 94% of Black women voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, but a majority of white women voted for Donald Trump? So again, we have the 2018 midterms. Here's something that I can send you out if you'd like to watch, but what I want you to know is, of course, ERA still has not been passed. And I think there has been a little bit more momentum to reconsider it. But I want to end with thanking feminists. It's hard to know what kind of note to end on when in this weird moment in history, right? Like with my students, I mean, I want them to know that feminists fought for all these legal rights, all these cultural changes, that it's great that you can go and not be discriminated against for being pregnant, or at least not overtly, or for being a woman, or for being a person of color. But all these, it's all about enforcement. It's all about keeping our foot on the gas pedal, as again, the League of Women Voters does so well. Citizen rights for women, thank a feminist, voting and all kinds of other citizenship rights, championing the right to vote. What I talked about, like collective bargaining and related workplace gains around parental leaves, equal pay. A lot of our unions now are they're weakened, but they're driven by women, particularly in like the AFT. Equal pay legislation, at least as a start, we have some. Expanded rights of women of color and LGBT communities. Claiming women's sexual rights, claiming women's right to enjoy sex, women's right to not be raped, all those different things, like to be talked about differently in medical textbooks and sex education, to like all the cultural stuff around sexuality. Reproductive rights, fragile as they might seem, they have been around, making a huge difference. The historian Leslie Reagan argues that Roe v. Wade was one of the largest steps forwards in women's health overall. It was so path-breaking. Protections against discrimination in hiring, promotion, pay, and sexual harassment, Social Security benefits, family leave. Thank a feminist. It's not as far along as we want it to be, but feminism has made a difference. Just naming and creating law and cultural change around gendered violence is so important. Being able to call your husband beating you domestic violence rather than my problem. I saw a moving statement from a woman in a documentary about that once. Like she saw Ms. Magazine and was like, oh, that happens to other women. Oh, that's not just me and me not behaving well for my husband. Like just naming is important. More equitable, demanding more equitable marriages, including the rights of LGBT people to marry. Demanding more equitable healthcare and making some progress. Studying it all. Having students learn about it, at least in college, kind of skipped over in high school. And then related research and teaching and advocacy. Continuing to raise our voices about the frayed social safety net that is creating disproportionate poverty. I mean, we named the feminization of poverty back in the 70s. It's still there. It's disproportionately impacting women of color. And we have a punitive government oftentimes, not just a stingy government, but a punitive government, especially felt by women of color, addressing police brutality and mass incarceration in their communities. We have a lack of access to living wages, universal health care, childcare, equal pay, freedom from violence. We have lots of work to do. It is an ongoing struggle. But I want to emphasize that throughout history, these feminist gains have been made when we've mobilized as citizens and stayed mobilized and stayed informing one another as you all are doing. Building coalitions, it's messy, it's hard. We have to really do deep listening to one another. White women need to work hard on their racism. We need to work hard on our classism and homophobia as well, and transphobia. We need to engage men in creative ways. We need to understand that gender is socially constructed and talk about gender in more inclusive ways. There are non-binary people, there are intersex people, there are trans people who are helping create new possibilities in feminism. So it's a moment of exciting change and ongoing issues. I think I hit it on the time to give you 15 minutes of Q&A. I see some questions and maybe I will end my show, right? Can I do that? You good with that? See if I can. Oh, that might be hard.
Jodi, yeah, and I think the The first question that Cindy had is if you could talk a little bit more about the status of the ERA, where it's going, why it hasn't passed, and what needs to be done to get it to pass.
I don't know if I can give you an up to the minute on the, in fact, you all would probably be better positioned to know that. I mean, part of why it didn't pass in the past was that we had an organized opposition from women, well financed by many men, in the form of Phyllis Schlafly, who raised all these issues about, like, imagine this, gender neutral bathrooms and women being drafted into the military, and the sort of villainizing the cultural radicals of the women's movement, who were saying a lot of hostile things about men and marriage and domesticity, and creating sort of a divide that was mostly among white women, because Black women supported the ERA in much larger numbers. But white women, many middle-class white women, benefited in certain ways from, or were afraid to change the gender status quo. So there's a lot of, like, there's a book called How We Lost the ERA that kind of goes into a lot of those things. I know that there has been a renewed interest in it, and I'm just racking my brain because it seems like in the last couple of years, there has been this, like, potential to revive it on the congressional floor. It was introduced every year from 1923 until it passed both houses in 72, but then it had a sunset clause in 1982. I don't know if others could speak to that. I really can't give you the right now piece. Fingers crossed. But I'm not, you know, now that we have our partisan divide includes a divide on gender issues that is really different from where it was in the 1970s. In the 1970s, you had, the divide was partly that there were more labor feminists in the Democratic Party who were afraid of taking away the protective labor legislation because they'd fought in unions to get some, like, reductions in working hours for women to protect their motherhood. And that was like a different kind of schism. But you had a lot more Republican women who were like, of the National Women's Party, let's just get the ERA, let's just get it done, worry about that other stuff later. And now you have a partisan divide that is really more like avowedly anti-feminist on the Republican side, and, you know, avowedly anti-choice. And so, like, that's making me very skeptical about whether the ERA could ever get passed in the near future. I don't know if that's helpful.
Oh, I think everything, all the comments are really helpful, so thank you. There's another question about the role that Patty Hearst plays in terms of feminist history, that she seems to have many elements of wealth, interracial violence, political, cultural independence. Do you have any thoughts or comments on Patty Hearst?
Patty Hearst, like from the 1970s?
Yeah.
Oh, wow, I'm sorry, but that she has not shown up in my sort of the way I create the narratives around this. But what is, can I get more on the question? Maybe I can just provide some context. I mean, I remember she was kidnapped, right? And she was part of a cult. Am I remembering correctly?
Well, let's see. It was Margaret Wood's question. I wonder if we can ask, Mary, is there a way of asking Margaret to unmute and be able to ask her question?
You're asking a technical question.
See, I can't unmute her.
Yes, there actually is. I can do that if Margaret is willing to do that. This is Margaret.
Margaret Larson? I'm sorry, Margaret Wood.
Okay. All right, Margaret, you are being allowed to talk if you want to talk.
Okay, am I unmuted now?
Yes, you
Yeah.
are.
Okay, well, yes, she is from my era. I was just wondering if there was a backlash, or you've pretty much got the story straight. She was from the Hearst publishing family. She was kidnapped by the Symbionese liberation movement, and then she was forced to participate in a bank robbery. And then, she was brought to trial. But, I just wondered if all of those issues that she was a woman kidnapped and forced to lead quite a different lifestyle, in the end, she she herself had some transformation in being more accommodating to another lifestyle. But I just wondered if there was a backlash in the feminine movement about her experience, and she was so publicized.
Such an interesting case, and you're bringing it back to me, but I have not really seen any research about the intersection of that media coverage about her and feminism. I mean, I guess, you know, the idea that media often likes to clutch on to the idea, to a story about women's victimization and being kidnapped, particularly white women. I have a colleague who teaches the violence against women class, and he's always emphasizing the many stories about women of color who experienced abduction, gendered violence, and didn't get the media coverage. In fact, we have a rash of, you know, missing and murdered Indigenous women. That's a whole movement to look at that. White women often kind of fan the flames of like, aren't we supposed to protect them in our like media coverage? And so there could have been a little bit of like a, look, women need our protection. They can be easily manipulated. Look what happened to Patty Hearst. It could be, but I can't say because I really have not, I have not seen the Patty Hearst story come up in sort of the general chronicles of that period that I've read. Someone's probably done some great research on it. I just don't know it. It's a great question.
Thanks.
I have another question that's not written here, but it's my question, and that is, you talked a lot about that societal disruptions kind of caused people to retreat from the pushing forward on women's issues. And I feel like right now we're in, like, disruption is the norm of our lives right now. We've got pandemics, we've got wars, we have political strife, we have great divisiveness from the political spectrum. And I'm wondering, and we're seeing challenges on progress that we've made like everywhere. So like, how do we get beyond that? Like, what if the disruptions never end? I'm kind of just wondering what brings those disruptions to an end, and how can we use some of these issues to maybe bring people together? I'm not sure if that's a question or just asking for you to comment on.
Or a lament that I share.
Yeah.
It's a great question. I don't have the answer, but I had such a great conversation with my students the other day, just talking about the mid 20th century period in my history of motherhood and the disruptions and all that. And it was a reminder that, yeah, our disruptions are the new normal. And that, yeah, the historian in me sees this constant, like the chaos foments, and then there's like a quote, like sort of a forced return to normal. Like we're gonna, and that often does push back progress around social equality. And that's a concern, you know, that's a deep concern, because I support all the movements for social equality that are going on, other forms of equality that are going on now. So my concern is that we might have a forced new normal, but that, you know, change, like I said about the 50s, the change keeps going. You can't, I mean, a lot of this backlash is to the changing demographics of the United States that is getting less white. And that is not going to just stop, you know, and that's not a new concern either. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt wanted white women to have more babies because he said they were committing race suicide by not doing so. And we had all these immigrants, you know, and so I don't know where it's going to end, or where it's going to reach a new like resting point. My fear is that enforced normal might not just be around the social equality, but around democracy itself. I think we're all pretty worried about that if we're paying attention, you know, that like sometimes that kind of normalcy is restored by very authoritarian means. And I mean, I'm talking beyond the United States, right? I'm talking like world history wise. And how do you address this population, the trauma of our population around all these disruptions? Sometimes a strongman type person ends up getting power as a result of that. You know, in the 1950s, we had, in late 40s, we had the kind of hysteria of anti-communism and Joseph McCarthy, and we finally put him in his place, and some semblance of order got restored to our political systems. That also meant we took care of him, but we also purged all the unions of their radicals. We also, you know, put down racial justice movements and called women neurotic, and, you know, but then things grew out of that. So like, there's there's just so many strands going on. And there's a lot of like genies you can't put back in the bottle with respect to people raising their expectations about their rights. So whenever we have like a period of intense justice movements like we had in the late 60s and like we're having now, again, you can't put that genie back in the bottle. But what happens to it? Because, you know, I mean, Tiananmen Square happened in China. What happened to that? You know, I mean, it really depends on what we do now, I think, and what we're able to do now. And I don't know what that's going to be. And if others have thoughts, like, I don't know. $1 million question.
That's right. That's right. All right. Well, Mary, I'm going to turn it over to you. I don't know if you have a final question or just want to make closing comments. Jodi, thank you so
Oh,
much. This
you
has
know
been
me, I
fascinating.
always have questions.
Mhm.
Okay, I'm a baby boomer, and pretty much, you know, after the 60s and the 70s, feminism, the word, just the term feminism became kind of a stigma. And in many circles, it was almost derogatory. And it hasn't been until recently that I've noticed that it's become a little more accepted. So how would you fight that stigma, or how would you change that that thought that anyone who is a feminist is just a radical, bra burning, I don't know, witch, basically.
Well, there's lots of, I mean, part of what I try to do is teach the history in a nuanced way, which is not something everyone can, you know, not everyone's going to go do that, but like, I'm trying to do a little education around the complexity of what feminism is and has been. I think we also need to continue to build coalitions and understand that it's messy. And like I said, I think we need to find new ways to engage men. I think we need to, like, there's a "This is what a feminist looks like" campaign that our students often get on board with, to show that like lots of people are feminists, and this is just sort of basic thank a feminist. Like, are you glad that you have the right to like make your own medical decision? I didn't even go into that. Like, there's a great story in the When Everything Changed book by Gail Collins, where she talks about a woman who's got breast cancer, and the doctor asks her husband about the right to do a mastectomy. And she's like, what about me? And he says, well, women are irrationally connected to their breasts. And basically just the right to like have your own medical self-determination. There are so many things that we take for granted. I think sometimes too quickly we go to Roe v. Wade, which can be a divisive issue, but actually there's just like a lot more, you know, employment rights, educational access. How'd you like to be told you can't be a lawyer? You know, like there's, I guess that's part of it, is just finding some nuggets and some examples. And recognizing that's not new for feminists to be derided and to be told that they're divisive and they're witch. That's not new at all. I mean, it happened. I used to teach the history of feminist thought going back to like, you know, the era of Christ. Like, there's still like women that want to talk about like gender inequality. It's a dangerous thing. Women get trolled on the internet all the time. Women don't have the same freedom of speech to talk about these issues. And so part of it is we also need our allies. We need our male allies to help move that forward. We need more spaces where men show up and talk about this.
And not about our clothes. Or
Right.
Or if we smile too much or too little.
Right. Or not enough.
Or not enough, yes. Well, thank you so much. We're running out of time. But thank you. It's so important for us to know where we've been and what progress has been made in order to realize how much could be lost and why elections are so important. I'm going to share what is going on here now. We have some programs that are coming up that we would like you to be aware of. One is the School District of Homan's Forum, because education is important, and that is going to be March 21st at 7. And again, anything that we do on Zoom is recorded and put on our website. And this one, all right, this is why our league strives to get this kind of information out. So Saturday, March 19th, we're going to be doing our legislative breakfast. I know it's going to be on Zoom. So if you have breakfast, we won't, you can chew away on whatever you want. But we do have Senator Baldwin, Ron Kind, Representative Ron Kind, and Steve Poff, Jill Billings, and Steve Doyle have all committed to come and speak. And you will be able to ask questions. Now, it should be noted, this is a members only program. So if you would like to be part of this, it's very easy to join the League of Women Voters. And then you would be able to attend this. Look on our website for how to register. And I do want to mention too, that we invited all of our representatives and asked them to come. So if there's any names that are missing, it is because they declined for some reason or other. And also, please note that our April program is going to be on Monday, April 11th. And we're going to have speakers that are addressing urban, suburban, rural climate actions being taken in our own backyard. And again, you can register for this program on our website at lwvlacrosse.org. And this, I don't have a slide for, but in addition, March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, there will be a special short program on the clean water referendum that you will see on your spring ballot. And check our website for more details on that. So this concludes our program. Please be safe, stay warm, stay well, and think spring thoughts. See you next month. Thank you.
I'm going to hop off. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was excellent. Very, very excellent. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.